This is Dr. Monique Akassi. She's the Interim Special Assistant to the President for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Strategic Initiatives. And as a tenured full professor in English, she's published over 23 times and has presented research nationally and internationally. We'd like to thank you for your time today, Dr. Akassi.
Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate the introduction. If you don't mind, if you can just pull back up the screen that you had for just a second with, I think it was a tan screen. I don't know if it disappeared or not. Yes, okay, thank you. All right, so I thank each and every one of you for attending today. I am honored to be here today to talk to you all today about a reexamination for strategic planning for diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. And I want to speak specifically about my experience thus far here at West Liberty University and beyond at other institutions as well. As we know, diversity, equity, and inclusion is becoming a very big global movement, if you will, and it's not going anywhere at this time. And one of the things that we have to do when we start looking at DEI in the classrooms and beyond, whether you're a teacher, a professor, a director, a coordinator, whatever the case may be, one of the first things that we have to do is to go on a listening tour. Okay, you never want to go into a classroom, onto a campus, into a school and immediately start pushing out initiatives regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the first thing we have to do is to go on a listening tour, learn the culture, hear people's concerns from students to faculty to staff to the global community at large. But it's very important to hear everyone's concerns because many times we have misconceptions about what diversity, equity, and inclusion is all about. So it is vitally important to hear the needs and concerns of people. I know when I first started January 31st, I went on my listening tour and there were many that thought DEI, didn't understand what DEI was about. One person said, "Are you the DEI police?" I said, "Oh my goodness, really?" And some thought it was just a black and white situation that's playing out throughout our nation. And so through listening, looking at it from a qualitative perspective and ethnographic research, and ethnographic research is one of my favorites because with ethnographic research, you're simply observing. You're observing and you're writing and you're collecting data through observations. And that's what I was doing. And from that, I was able to gather a lot of rich data from people in general, from students to faculty to staff and a global community. But then I also had put together, in collaboration with our institutional research, quantitative data where I actually compiled questions that I sent out anonymously to faculty, staff, and students. And this could be done at any level, from a classroom to a department to a unit, school, college, and beyond. But that anonymous survey also helped because from a quantitative perspective, I was able to get more information. Quantitative meaning, as we know, do you strongly agree, or disagree regarding our school is diverse, or we do practice equity and so forth. And I noticed most of the rich data from the marginalized groups, if you will, the minority groups, I received the most authentic data, if you will, from their listening tours. Many of them, especially if you're doing quantitative research, the data could be washed out, if you will, from the marginalized groups if you're at an institution where the majority consist of mainstream society. And so, of course, the majority said the institution is diverse and there are no issues. But it was in that comment section where, from a small marginalized group, where I witnessed the testimonies of feeling invisible or feeling voiceless or not feeling included due to sexuality, race, or socioeconomic background, or a disability, or due to gender, and the list goes on. And so from that information, and then of course, gathering the groups together, for instance, we had a multicultural group that we put together, and it was difficult trying to gather them together, even for a multicultural group, just to have a sit-down conversation with our minority students on campus. We actually had to collaborate with the head of sports here, with Coach Ullum, in order to get the majority of the minority students to meet with us, and we provided food and snacks and so forth, and even invited our president. And we had a sit down, intimate conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion as minorities on campus. And that's where a lot of additional rich data came out, where students shared that their survival technique many times is assimilation, and to just not even bring up topics about diversity because it makes them feel uncomfortable sometimes, because they're trying to survive and they're trying to blend in order to fit in. But many during that meeting had also shared that they felt like they were losing a part of their identity in the process. And so that raised a concern, because yes, we definitely want to promote assimilation, but we don't want anyone to feel as though their identity has to be obliterated in the process, right? And so we wanted to share with them that we are creating safe spaces and creating alliances where students can celebrate being their unique individual selves, and that they can also practice assimilation and have a sense of belonging on campus, right? So we started there with that. But then, of course, an advisory group had to be made as well. And with this advisory group, the advisory group was very important, because with an advisory group, you just don't want people on campus, you want people in the community as well. And the purpose for the DEI advisory group is to get advice from different stakeholders regarding strategic initiatives moving forward with a diversity, equity, and inclusion program that would last, not one just as a checkbox to check off, we've done this and we've done that, but actually one to last. And so from that, we were able to come up with a strategic plan, a mission statement, and a vision. I'm not for sure if I'm able to share that or not, but I'll see. But I'll continue to talk through it. So once we were able to come up with a mission, a vision, and a strategic plan, and when you come up with a strategic plan, of course, you want to practice shared governance with this as well. But you want to have goals and objectives, ideally at least 5, and then objectives underneath those. And from that, you want to be able to share it. And this can serve as a measurement because DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is indeed the DNA throughout an entire institution. It's we can't escape it. It's in every area within the academy. And so from that, from the mission and the vision and the strategic planning, that helped as far as with giving people a foundation that we could work with and unity. And then from there, we also started finding out from students and from our DEI committee, because we have a DEI committee that focuses on students. And that's under the auspices of our DEI office here. But we also cover employees as well. But from that, there was talk of a need for more activities and initiatives to cultivate unity on campus. And so here at West Liberty, we were already doing a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion on campus, but it was just all spread out. So through the DEI office, we're able to connect the dots, and all DEI initiatives from the faculty to the staff to the students now all fall under the auspices of the DEI office. And so we have, in just a few months from January 31st up into the present, we have a monthly DEI newsletter that comes out, and it showcases faculty, staff, students, and it also serves as a platform for teachable moments, right? And so we use Constant Contact for it, and it's a beautiful platform because you can embed videos. And so we have video tutorials, video conversations that showcased our inaugural lavender ceremony to recognize the LGBTQIA plus students that were graduating this past May at West Liberty, as well as our inaugural multicultural ceremony that we also was inaugural. And so that was showcased in the newsletter. We also had a second chance prom this semester for those who have been impacted from COVID and did not have a prom. And that was a huge success as well. So those monthly newsletters have created a sense of belonging, transparency, and awareness, and creating this safe space, this judge-free zone that we're creating here and building upon, if you will, at West Liberty University. We also have launched our book club, our inaugural summer virtual book club, and our selected book is How to Be an Anti-Racist by national best-selling author, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Now, this book club that just launched, we were a little nervous about it. It started this week on Tuesday, but oh, was it a highly successful initiative to launch. We had so many people that showed up, and just reinforcing and reiterating, this is a judge-free zone. It's a safe space. We're not going to judge. We're going to keep open minds and open ears to what we read about and discuss. And through that, we are building an alliance. We're standing together in solidarity and creating a cohort, if you will, that will continue in this upcoming academic year. We also have a virtual international conference coming up in December, as well as 2 peer review referee journals that will launch this August. And it will focus on research papers submitted by one for students and the other for scholars, teachers, and faculty, staff, and a global community. But research, latest research experiences and so forth regarding the topics of DEI. And we have a podcast that's getting ready to come out. So through these initiatives, these have become some high impact practices that have been working here at West Liberty University. And interestingly enough, study shows in a recent Harvard Business Review, and I fell victim to this as well, but in a recent Harvard Business Review, studies show that when we try to mandate and force faculty, staff, and students to take these online created DEI professional development courses, if you will, there's a lot of resistance. And I too, as a pilot, we went ahead and rolled out, okay, you have to take this DEI mandatory online professional development. And I tried to choose the shortest one possible, which was only 40 minutes long, because we know how long those can be. Well, it backfired. A lot of people complied, but I did have a few faculty that said, Dr. Akassi, one said this was too simplistic. This was too simplistic. And I had to share, there are some people that don't even know what DEI is. So I tried to find one that was, as simplistic, but the shortest one possible so people wouldn't get upset. But the other one, another faculty member shared, I just don't think it should be mandated. And so exactly what the Harvard Business Review said, that's what I observed. There was some resistance. And so the best practice, according to the Harvard Business Review recent research, is this. Instead of using those mandated tests on DEI for faculty, staff, and students, look into mentorships, building those alliances, those safe space groups, and those mentorships. This is the #1 high impact practice in trying to promote solidarity and openness, if you will, with DEI. So with that being said, moving forward, we will definitely create even more safe spaces. Our mission this upcoming academic year is unity. We even have a unity garden now too, up here on the hilltop. And we want to promote unity this upcoming academic year. And I think through all the innovation and the high impact practices that I've shared with you through my ethnographic research, I think that it will be successful. It's worked at other institutions, including my recent institution, George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I was charged to do something very similar, and it was highly impactful. And many times people assume, oh, George Washington University, that's probably totally different demographics. You have, a lot of people of the bourgeoisie students that go there, but that's not true. There are a lot of students at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. that are there on academic scholarships, a large population that are coming from Ohio and West Virginia, from the Midwest as well. And so even in the classroom, and this is my final point that I want to make in regards to strategic planning and going now from a macro level now to a micro level. So as a professor in the classroom, we were charged to have theme-based courses for the year. And so my theme was devoted to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the class maxed out. It became a favorite with the students to the point where they were willingly, highly recommending their friends and their friends of friends to take it. And this was a freshman level writing intensive course. But we read How to Be an Anti-Racist, and we read Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I could not go into the classroom with this preachy approach, if you will. I had to go in with more of, I couldn't go in with a direct pedagogical approach, as Bartholomew would say. I had to go in more with a Peter Elbow process pedagogical, expressionist pedagogical framework. So when I started the first day of class at George Washington University in regards to reexamining strategic planning for DEI, even in the classroom, first day, I told them, I said, we're getting ready to go on a speed meet. How many of you have heard of speed date before? And they sort of chuckled and raised their hand. And I said, okay, I'm gonna set my stopwatch. I said, everybody stand up, and you are going to share with a student in the class, this is the first day of class, a time when you felt invisible, silenced, or alienated. Okay, and the stopwatch is going to be set for a minute. And every time a minute is hit, then you got to switch to the next classmate and the next. And that students, the majority told me, Dr. Akassi, that first day, that icebreaker with the speed meet and sharing a time when we felt invisible, that sealed the deal. We felt at that time, we're going to love this class. This is going to be a judge-free, safe zone. And we found out that we're not alone, that we too have experienced some form of not feeling inclusive or belonging, no matter what background we came from. We share that unified connection. And so after that, and being able to write about it, and to share with the class times when they felt alienated. From there, that was a good segue into the first reading, the literature, Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. Now, I know some of us perhaps are under scrutiny and can't have certain books, banned books in our class, but we know even through literature and even through everyday life experiences, we can still create a space where students can talk about times when they felt alienated. And Stanley Fish, a renowned scholar, he has a book called Save the World on Your Own Time, right? And the title speaks for itself. However, we have to keep in mind that we are also in a movement towards experiential learning. And we know cultivating critical thinking skills is definitely a high priority. So there are ways where you don't have to push your agenda onto students. Give them a safe space. You don't have to have this goal of, I'm going in to try to save the world and change their minds. That's not the case. We have to start reimagining and strategizing a space where these students have a place to talk and not be judged, and to critically think in preparation for the global community and being our future leaders. So starting inward with those students on a micro level created a segue on a macro level in order to introduce them to a book where they were able to read about someone else who also, or a group or a population that's also felt alienated or silenced. Many of my students felt alienated or silenced due to socioeconomic hardships, or due to sexuality or gender, right? even eating disorders and battling that over the years. Those were some of the major issues that the students at George Washington shared with me. Now, as a professor at Howard University, ironically, I was doing the same test with my Howard University students. And at Howard, it's a historically Black university. So over there, students were talking mostly about their experiences with colorism or being at Howard. There are a lot of students from what we call the Black bourgeoisie. So a lot of those students, their parents were judges, lawyers, doctors, and engineers. So for them, a lot of their testimonies talked about being the only Black student at these elite schools and these boarding schools and how they felt alienated. So it's interesting looking at and comparing my George Washington students and things that they've experienced in their lives about feeling alienated in comparison to my Howard University students, and then creating a day where they were able to connect virtually through Zoom, which I highly recommend because a lot of the students at Howard, they're in, if you will, like this Black world where the majority of the students are Black students, and a lot of them are coming from elite backgrounds, if you will. And then my George Washington University students, the majority part of mainstream society, but you had a mixture of the bourgeoisie and middle class and lower class and everything mixed in between. But it's interesting to see how their narratives intersect with each other regarding these universal themes of they all have, in some point in their life, felt silenced, invisible, alienated, or ostracized. So it was beautiful to see that. And from there, they formed strong bonds and relationships that continue today. And then after the reading, of course, we got into doing mock debates about topics within the books that they enjoyed. And we ended with what we called a social justice service learning project. And with this, they had to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion on the topic of their interest. And they really enjoyed that. A lot of the George Washington University students did topics, they took their smartphones out, they created documentaries, some did podcasts, but it was a multi-genre project where they wrote about it, but they also did something in the community. So many of them did things such as in DC for the homeless population, a community garden. Several of the women did things on dealing with women's rights, right? Over at Howard, it was topics regarding colorism and Black Lives Matter and building healthy relationships with the police and bringing the police in the community and forming that community base with the police and building those bridges. So through all of that, and the re-examination, what I call the remix of strategic planning for diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education and beyond, from the university level to the school level to the classroom to the community and beyond. Through such strategies, I've witnessed through my findings, these are some of the high impact practices that are promoting solidarity and unity in the academy. Thank you, everyone. And I am open to questions and comments and feedback at this time.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Akassi? Your research is very interesting. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Megan. I see your comment. And I'm very much open. My first love will always be the classroom. I'm an educator at heart. I started out, from substitute teaching to teaching K through 12 to entering into higher ed, from adjunct instructor, lecturer, assistant, associate to full professor, and now in upper administration, from department chair to associate provost to here as special assistant. So I've seen it all. And I'm open to any and all. You know, I know it can be scary sometimes trying to get buy-in and support from upper administration to the community and with parents and students and beyond, but it definitely can be done. Lisa Delpit has a book called Other People's Children. Many of you have probably heard of that, but she also warns niceness can be a form of oppression too. So when we think about these topics and this movement right now with diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes we think the safe space, the safe thing to do is just niceness. But she says that can be a form of oppression. Sometimes, you know, I have a son that just graduated as well, and he's headed off to college. But there are some harsh realities that he had to be exposed to. Plato talks about it in the Republic, an allegory of the cave. You know, we can't continue to turn our backs to life's harsh realities. Eventually, you know, it's going we're going to be approached with it one time in our life. And for many, for students, a lot of times the classroom is that safe space. For our colleagues, the safe space in the academy. You know, and then we also have to think about our approach. You know, our delivery is not a one size fit all. We have to think about the rhetorical situation. When we deliver messages, the audience plays a key factor in the way that we deliver things. You know, so my delivery to my George Washington University students was totally different from my delivery to my students at Howard University. And my delivery to my esteemed colleagues here at West Liberty University is totally different than some of my other institutions. So we have to be careful not to do this one size fit all approach. We have to leave our egos at the front door, humble ourselves and listen to find out what culture are we dealing with and what are their concerns and how can we customize and work collectively in the name of shared governance with our audience as well. You know, Lisa Delpit argues, and there's definitely truth to this, that many times, especially Black students, and teaching is very much connected to parenting style, right? So Lisa Delpit argues a lot of students of color, delivery. So if we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, studies show that they tend to respond better to more of a direct pedagogical approach because it's similar to the direct parenting style. So for instance, my son is biracial. His maternal grandmother is Caucasian. So growing up, I noticed a different parenting style. She would say, you know, would you like peas, green beans, or carrots with your dinner tonight? You know, and that's more of a process approach where it's giving options, right? But when he was with me, it was more of a direct style because that's coming from my culture, more direct. Is you're having green beans tonight. But Mom, I don't want the green beans. I don't care. You're having green beans tonight. So the same applies, study shows, and Lisa Delpit's Other People's Children, with our approach and how what would this look like with a reexamination of strategic planning, even in the classroom, but with diversity, equity, and inclusion. For one group, giving these options, you know, with my George Washington University students, giving them these options and keeping it free, they said worked for them. because they going in, they automatically thought on the first day, oh my goodness, this professor, she's probably going to be a preacher and telling us, you do not do this, and racism is bad, and this is, but I didn't do that. And they like that. They like the option of having it organic, and for me, not projecting any of my views onto them, but giving them this space to explore and starting from within, and how at a time they may have felt silence. And only then, when they were able to connect, as the great rhetorician scholar Kenneth Burke would say, A cannot identify with B unless A finds a common denominator. Once you find that common denominator, then you become consubstantial with that audience, right? So for my students, the majority of this mainstream society, giving them that option of going from within and looking at those universal themes helped to build that connection and trust. Likewise, with the students, if it may be a majority people of color population students and or faculty, giving that same approach, but going in direct as well. I noticed giving them direct by sharing some of my direct testimonies sort of broke that glass ceiling, if you will. And so they felt like, okay, she's being vulnerable too, and she's not going to judge because she also has dealt with struggles. Here she is, she's my teacher, or she's my colleague, because I'm even doing it in our book club here at West Liberty. First day, I share with them times where I've experienced it, and they're like, oh, okay. So it's like a trust building up, and it's like, I'm not a judge and I'm not omnipotent. We're all in this together, and we can learn and grow together. So those are, just to add to it, those are some observations and best practices that I've experienced thus far, from the classroom to the global community and beyond.
We have a question from Dr. Vishaka Maskey. Her question is, can you give more examples of different tools, modalities to include DEI in an online classroom, given students are not interacting synchronously? Now, Dr. Maskey teaches economics.
Yes, and that's a great question. Over at George Washington University, I taught economics students, grad students, but it was synchronous, helping them with their master's thesis and dissertations and so forth. So I thank you, Dr. Maskey, for that question. So in regards to giving examples, so I'm assuming that the class is asynchronous. So I would definitely recommend, as far as different tools and modalities, to include DEI in a classroom, given students are interacting on a more asynchronous approach. I would definitely implement case studies. Videos are really good. Embedding those videos. I don't know what platform you're using, but whether it's Canvas, Blackboard, or whatnot, but we all have our platforms, but embedding these scenarios, these video scenarios, and then posing a question in the discussion board, where students have to respond to the question, but also respond to two classmates as well. I've also noticed these multi-genre approaches that have been highly effective. Students, we're dealing with Gen Zs and millennials. So readings where they're able to, they could do a reaction through video. It could be a book review or an article review through the form of embedding it on YouTube and talking about it, but of course, still building that conversation, that community where their fellow classmates are able to view it and they're able to respond to it and engage in healthy dialogue and conversations. Now, of course, you got to set the tone and let them know this is a safe space, judge-free zone. All comments and feedback are welcome. But I think definitely those are some of the best impact practices. And of course, the professor, the teacher can engage in those conversations as well through the discussion board. And studies show also some of those students that are not as talkative in person, sometimes it reverses and they're very interactive behind the screen, and so facilitating those questions, having those little case study prompts and turning it student focused, where you're giving students the freedom to express and critically think, can go a long way with that. Yes.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions for Dr. Akassi?
And of course, when we go back to experiential learning, DEI can be very scary, but we have to make sure that there are many different approaches we can take with this. It's not just black and white. We're dealing with mental health. We're dealing with disabilities. We're dealing with first generation. We're dealing with Appalachians, socioeconomic hardships. We're dealing with sexism, all the isms out there applied to DEI. And so observing the class and seeing their interests, and sometimes educators, we have to become like water and very fluid and see where their interest lies and carpe diem, seize that moment and maximize on that, because the world is small now. And if we don't get some type of grapple on this, because we're trying to cultivate global leaders and making those cross-cultural connections and celebrating our differences, our ableisms, right? Because that's what makes us beautiful. Even our Unity Garden here at West Liberty University right now, we don't just have a garden of tomatoes. We have tomatoes, corn, peppers, and it makes it beautiful, and it's symbolic for celebrating the diversity and the inclusiveness and the belonging, as long as we can keep those deer away. But it's beautiful, and it doesn't have to be like pulling teeth. And as educators, we hold a lot of power in shaping the future, but doing it in a way, as Edward Said warns, who recently died a couple years back, but in his theory, Orientalism, he warns not to look through our gaze and project it onto other cultures, and to use our culture as the report card on how others should be. He warns against that. Instead, as Homi Bhabha would argue, why not try to celebrate people's individualities, and we can become hybrid in doing so. We know our foundations and our identities, and we may not agree or disagree with all beliefs, but as intellectuals and practitioners, we can at least acknowledge and respect while holding on to our own personal views and identities in the process. And I purposely did not want to do, I started to do PowerPoint, but I said, no, I wanted this to be more fluid, more informal and talkative, so that it could create that type of space where we could talk openly and freely during this session, and to learn from each other as well in a safe space.
Okay, anyone?
Well, I like to perhaps, would anyone like to share any strengths or that anything that you've recently observed that's worked in your classroom or beyond in regards to DEI? And the thing is, a lot of times we're already doing it. So we even have created, I teamed up with our provost, and we have a DEI statement that's optional for professors to put in their syllabi. Because we have to be careful with that word mandate, because when we say mandate, people sometimes they create this invisible wall. So he said, okay, here's an optional DEI statement that we could put in the syllabi to share with students to let them know that, you know, this is a safe space where we do not condone any types of isms, you know, sexism, racism, and ableism, and the list goes on. And I think that can also set the tone on day one as well. As educators, we have the power to set that tone, set that space as well. But has anyone experienced any barriers, any concerns, any fears that you've experienced perhaps that didn't go too well in the past? Let's talk about it, and let's see if we can come together. And you know, I'd love to keep in touch. My email is up as well, but you know, it doesn't always go well. You know, George Washington, there was a student that well, let me pull back. Before George Washington, there was a community college that I tried this approach with, and it backfired. And I'll tell you why, because I did not make that connection with those students at first. And it was when COVID first hit and there was a shutdown and we abruptly had to go to online, right? But when I had at that time, because I know Kendi personally, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Ta-Nehisi Coates was my former colleague. He's a professor at Howard University, but his book was a New York Times bestseller. It came out before Kendi's book. But I messed up at the 2-year college at the beginning when I first started with this ethnographic study, by immediately diving in and telling them, this is the book that we're going to be reading, and we're going to do an argumentative research paper on it. And immediately started, as soon as they started reading, and the population was in Virginia, in a rural setting. And so immediately there were some students saying, this book sounds, predominantly white students, they said, he sounds racist. I'm not going to read this book. It was even reported to the department chair. I don't want to read this book. It sounds racist. And it's a New York Times bestseller, and it wasn't racist, but I messed up by just immediately diving in without first going on a listening tour and getting a feel for the culture and making that connection with them. So I warn you, if you try to go in and just boom, take off running, it can backfire. And that's what happened to me at the 2-year college. And so that my DEI initiative in that classroom, it was a struggle from after, because it was from after spring break to the end. It was a struggle. And it was to the point where I had to make that last argumentative research paper optional. I said, I'll drop the lowest score. So the ones, there were 2 of them, but sometimes all it takes is those 2 students. So it was 2 students, and he said, I'm not writing a paper. I'm not reading a book. They still passed because they were excellent students, but they were like, that's it. I'm not going through this. I'm not going to do it. So you have to be very, definitely have to do lots of re-examinations and strategic approaches at how we look at this DEI from the macro level, whether you're at the macro level or the micro level with it. Okay, now I'm not going to talk anymore. Any questions? Any tidbits? I'd love to learn as well. Any tidbits? Any aha moments? Any takeaways? Anything that you liked? Anything that you questioned from today's discussion with this panel?
I know we don't have a particularly quiet group, so someone has to have a story to share.
Oh, okay. I see Dr. Maskey I'm sorry, I didn't see this. Thank you, Dr. Maskey. It says you discussed experiential learning examples. I have found that when you create a team with students with diverse backgrounds, including academic backgrounds, they learn more, yes, and create a better project. However, it is difficult in the beginning while creating that diverse team because students want to work with their friends. What statements have worked for you when you are justifying your reasoning for creating a diverse team? This is an excellent question, Dr. Maskey. And this is one who I've traveled a lot because my husband is from a different continent, and he speaks 5 languages, and he's a French, Spanish, and Portuguese professor. So he opened up the world to me. So I always tell them, and I'm a big component for those group projects, because one day they're going to be in corporate, and again, the world is getting smaller, and we want our students to be prepared. There are different negotiation styles depending on the culture. And so usually I tell them, especially like if it's business students or any students for that matter, I tell them, look, when we're comfortable, we're no longer growing. When you're uncomfortable, that's when growth happens. When we're uncomfortable, that's when the innovation happens, because we want different perspectives on a topic. That's what makes the beauty and the growth and the innovation of an institution, right? Of a business. We can lose big money if we're just constantly doing the feel goods and having the same approach. So it's interesting, for instance, going back to economics, and this can apply to any, but for instance, even with negotiating styles, right? We automatically think, especially if we're in America with negotiations, you come to the business table, the meeting starts promptly at this time, we start at this time, we make eye contact with each other, and we get down to business. But that's not the same. In certain cultures, if you make eye contact, it's an example of being pompous or arrogant. And when I went over to Africa to try to seal an MOU at the University of Bouaké, and I had to adjust. I said, okay, I'm the only woman that's going to be at this meeting. I thought we were immediately going to start, but no, they said, oh no, we have a hotel set up for you, Dr. Akassi. We're going to take you out to dinner. And so the whole day we're building that connection first in that culture. And then the next day we got down to business, but it still wasn't sealed. It wasn't until I got back to America that we had like part 3 of the negotiations. So to answer your question, Dr. Maskey, I think sharing with them the purpose and the mission is critical. The rationale, why we have to do these mix-ups. Same way as I started this presentation when I started with the speed meets. Remember, the speed meets, they were pushed out of their uncomfort zone. Every minute when the timer stops, you have to go to another person. And there was a lot of diverse groups, and they were shocked because these students, they had students from all over, from Russia, from South America, from all over the world, right? And they were like, whoa, so you also experience feeling silenced in regards to eating disorders or being bullied or being, and that's what that universal connection. And that in itself was beautiful because we had these diverse testimonies, and it was all connected going back to that umbilical cord of we all have experienced a time of feeling silenced, invisible, alienated, or ostracized. So again, there is beauty, and we never want to, like some of those students at the beginning of the presentation I shared with you, those students that feel as though, let me just blend in and obliterate my identity as a safe haven, as a way to survive in a foreign place. We want to celebrate the differences, because when we celebrate the differences, the business, the institution, it thrives. Our students thrive, our educators thrive, our community thrives. It's a win-win. Thank you. I think you're muted.
I am. Sorry about that. Does anyone have any final questions for Dr. Akassi? We've taken up an hour of her time today, and I appreciate, again, her sharing her expertise so much.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Willer, as well. She made a statement as well, attempts to make communication continuous in the classroom, sustaining dialogue. Excellent read as well. There are lots of readings out there, but yes, definitely. That's a really good one as well. So thank you. And if you need any other readings, maybe we could compile a reading list, but keep ongoing conversations. You have my email address. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
My pleasure.